we were talking about zombies last week, where the undead come from. The cemeteries, the graveyards, like the haunted ritual sites of the pyramids, the catacombs, like the, the scary stuff, like where it's like, but yeah, but I don't know, but is it? It's yeah, there's it seems like maybe not. Cemeteries, we think of it as being pretty scary. Like it does seem to be like in our modern stuff, that's where, the ghosts are hanging out. I don't know why, in cemeteries specifically, but yeah, I guess it's because it's where their body is, if they're linked to it. That's
Yeah.
yeah, it is a kind of I mean, everyone has them. We all ritualistic burial. I am mostly focused on just because it's more in my knowledge wheelhouse and it's more relevant, I think, to what we're talking about is like just Western burial stuff and that kind of thing. It seems more that's more like of a modern thing. It tends to be more, like starting in like more of like the Gothic era of, literature and things like that. Cemeteries were actually like initially starting as graveyards, right? Like in churches. But as
Hmm.
like populations grow, cities start expanding, like they like had to be they couldn't contain them and it also became somewhat of a public health hazard and nuisance to have them in there, so they started making giant cemeteries, like, but in like Victorian era and stuff like that, they're actually like the earliest form of public parks, and people would hang out
Oh,
and go
yeah.
and like and yeah, and it was like the common ground, and it was like people would go and like have a picnic there and do so, it was not that weird as things like other public parks and things come into play, and we start shifting into like that kind of like late 19th century, early 20th century. You It starts changing and people's views on it start getting more, it's more creepy, and like the rise of that kind of Gothic literature like Edgar Allan Poe or like Dracula or Mary Shelley, and like these this idea of like cemeteries now start taking on this kind of creepy demeanor, and people aren't hanging out there, and then a lot of the haunting stuff, that's when that kind of starts coming into play, and it starts popularizing.
Like, I wonder how much of it has to do with just the way we've been able to like really remove ourselves from exposure to death
Hmm.
as a society. Because if you think about like when we um talked about this before, like the idea of like the funeral parlor used to be your parlor. Like
Yeah.
it was just in the house, and the gravesite might just be in your yard.
Yeah.
It's like so
Or the
everything's
local church, where you're like of your community,
yeah,
consecrated ground,
yeah.
if you're
Bob,
of a Christian.
is that fact? Like they used to put them in their own backyard, or you just have more of like a speculating
Well,
kind
I'm
of?
talking about like family burials and things
Yeah,
like that,
Yeah, like
particularly in
on
the
farms and
States.
stuff like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Mhm. But as opposed to most of the world, where but because we had more space still, Even now we kind of still do. Golf courses. Sorry. Yeah.
I bounced that one off, Edgar Allan Poe's tombstone.
But yeah, like, but the idea of the very local burial, the family burial plot, or like that, the funeral, the body would sit in your parlor. And now it's kind of like everything's like very far removed. First of all, not as many of us die. Again, once again, but largely in the States, if you go back, 120 years, um, you know, infant mortality was way higher. It was
Oh yeah,
much more
100%.
likely to hear like, oh yeah, no, two of my brothers died when I was growing up or something like that. Or that happened a lot more frequently. Death was a lot closer in that regard. Um, and now it's kind of like largely we're removed from it in this society. So a lot of it is like it's just like you're alive and then there's death, and so your death is over here and it's creepy because it's not like this, or whatever.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the weird, yeah, like yeah, maybe like you're right, maybe it's more of like a kind of modern thing. No, obviously like ritual, burial and consecrating things like that. It's like that does go back. I mean, if you think about like was like the, obviously there's modern catacombs, like the catacombs in Paris. I'll say modern in the sense of like, it's not an ancient necropolis type of thing or something along those lines. But you have like like Roman catacombs, right? I mean, Roman burial rituals, probably like the closest to our modern version, right? Where it's like, oh, like but it was like the idea is like, the person needs to be laid to rest so their spirit can rest, right? It's like if they're not properly buried, that's when the things get hairy. Like
Yeah.
and it's like, and it's weird, like the Romans did have like ghost stories, but none of them are related, seemingly, at least I can find, are related to like the tombs, because that's where when people are buried properly, they don't haunt places. So like there's actually like there's like a Pliny the Elder or no, Pliny the Younger part of his story where that's like basically about a haunted house. And at the time, some other person who was like a philosopher person or whatever, and he like wanted to see what this haunting was all about. So he went to the haunted house and stayed there. And he saw the ghost of a man in chains and walked outside and then stopped. And then he ordered that the area around the house be like exhumed, and they found a corpse who was a man who was chained and buried on the house site. And then when they buried him in the cemetery or the catacombs or whatever, properly, the haunting stopped. So it was like not related to the cemetery. It was the lack of the ritual burial that caused the haunting, of the house, not.
It's not like it's haunted because it's got bodies in it.
Yeah.
It's like no. Like the bodies were pretty unhappy about the way that they were laid to rest, and so they're gonna mess your sleep up.
Does anyone know? So talking about burying people in the backyard, so to speak. So it wasn't uncommon for older houses when they had basements for the floors to be dirt. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So does anyone know, were they ever buried like in the basement, or is it always outside? Does anyone know?
I would imagine it's always. I'm going to go on a speculation, but I would imagine it's always outside because of like lack of and probably further away, lack of embalming techniques and things like that at the time. That would be pretty rough, that happening in your house. Even buried. Yeah. Well, that's the whole gases coming out from cemeteries and things like that. It's like that like the fog being like vampires or whatever. It's like that, and depending on the different cultures, it would like you might even let like some people, and this also then probably led to this the fear of being buried alive, or the which I guess we could talk a little bit about, the bells that you could ring if you were buried alive, and then other people having fear of being buried alive, they put them into like more of like a mausoleum type area until it was known that they were definitely dead, and then they would bury them. So give them like a couple weeks or something, I guess, or whatever it is, and then like that. But yeah, it's but I think it's always like I would not know. I mean, the closest thing would be like something like a catacombs, which would be like an underground, under like a city type of thing, though.
Yeah.
I think
and cities have smells of their own to kind of kind of blends in.
Originally, you probably know it from like Lord of the Rings or from like the video game Skyrim, but you have the Duergar. It's like a Nordic. Both could be a spirit, but it also is usually a spirit that's inhabiting a body. But they're in the like, so in Tolkien, that's the inspiration for like the barrow waits in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And it's like, so they're in these like the barrows are like the burial mounds, like that's that's pretty common in like the kind of Western European kind of stuff, usually for people that are more royal type of thing, that's and or like warrior graves and stuff. And so like, but they would be like isolated to that. They won't leave there. It's more of like, you come in there, then they'll get you. So like in Skyrim, like I don't know if you guys ever played, but that's like you spend a lot of time going down through ancient burial things, and there's lots of these guys attacking you, and you have to put but once you kill the thing, like it'll stop the spirit, so you can stop them from attacking you. But that kind of falls more into that zombie thing. But it's not. But they're not really. They're just like. But they won't leave the site. But that's like that weird like cursed tomb thing, the ancient Egyptian mummy curse thing is definitely more of like a 19th, 20th century European explorers, mostly getting popular during the whole Tutankhamun unearthing. And that's like the
Yeah.
similar thing. Like, but the mummy's curse isn't usually like the mummy's going to get you. It's usually like the spirit somehow gets you, after the fact, right?
Yeah,
But it's
yeah.
like, but again, it's not really like that. Doesn't seem to be like in coordination with like the actual Egyptian belief. That's more like something these other people brought and got popular. I think there isn't even an actual curse like inscription, which they're not really curses, but warnings to not disturb
Mhm.
the tomb. I don't even think there actually is one on Tutankhamun's tomb. Dan, you might know a little more about that because I think you've done a bit of research on that. But
Yeah,
like, it's yeah.
I don't know if there was actual ever a warning. I don't remember, but I do remember a bunch of people died afterwards. And it was all attributed to like I think it was like fungus or something that was in the
Right.
the tomb
Mhm.
itself that spores people inhaled or whatever.
Cover up.
Yeah, yeah, but it's like, yeah, it doesn't seem to be like that. The curse thing was seemingly something that other people brought to this, that wasn't
Yeah.
really doesn't seem to be in the Egyptian kind of belief system. So
I
yeah.
wonder if the Tutankhamun curse. I wonder if that more laid the way to like warnings of other tombs. I wonder if that's kind of like don't there might be curse. Like
Yeah.
don't
No.
disrupt them.
Well, so it's interesting. So the idea of like the cursed tomb or the cursed treasure goes back a ways because it's actually one of the most popular things in when we talk about the Necronomicon, the grimoire tradition. There's always these things for getting rid of the ghost that's guarding the treasure, and there are these like treasure hunting spirits and like treasure hunting uh spells and things like that. And the reason is because if you think about like when that's happening, like I guess like just like I don't know, post-feudal, Middle Ages, things like that. How much class mobility did you have? Like it's like there are lots of lottery spells, like because like how much class mobility did you have other than finding a bunch of treasure? And so people would go out looking for
Assuming
treasure.
someone didn't just confiscate it from you. Then once you
Yeah.
found
Well, exactly. Yeah. Find treasure, and you've probably hired your own well-armed party, and make sure they. Actually, maybe they shouldn't be that. Look, It's beyond my ability to actually recommend what to do about this, but what I can tell you is that there used to be this belief around treasure being guarded by ghosts and evil spirits to protect it from would-be gripper uppers, grabbers, thieves, and the like.
I need to do a quick like shameless plug for a second. So
Plug.
the other podcast I have time we discuss, I actually spoke to a guy, Charles Brakefield, who actually tells a story of a modern day treasure hunt. So if anyone is interested in hearing about a really fun story about a
Yeah.
modern day treasure hunt, the podcast Time We Discuss was episode 74. It dropped in, I think it was November of 2024.
Yeah, complete with a "Can you trust these guys?" kind of
Yes.
element, if I'm not mistaken.
it.
Oh man, I was gonna go on a pirate tangent, but let's not. Let's tangent right back into graves again. Well, not get into graves, but let's yeah.
So I mean, there are like I'll address that again, but these like I think most of the haunting ideas of graves do like at least from what I can understand, like graves or cemeteries are like definitely more like modern kind of thing. So even if they're based on an old ghost, so there's this one in Scotland that's like it's like bloody Mackenzie or whatever, and it's a person who died in like the 17th century and supposedly haunts that because he like killed a lot of and tortured a lot of people for religious, like he was a kind of prosecuting person for religious stuff. So he has this kind of figure, but like most of the hauntings there seem to stem from like the 90s. It's like popular. I made it into articles like in that time like they attacked people. It's like a poltergeist that attacked people, and they just said that's this ghost of this terrible person. But it's like, but again, it's like that, or like there's going back to like Paris, the cemetery there is supposed to like where Jim Morrison is buried. Supposedly he's haunting that, or like, or possibly Edgar Allan Poe is supposedly haunting the cemetery in Baltimore. It's like, but it's kind of like, well, again, most of these people died, like except for obviously the Scottish person in like in the 19th or 20th century, and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
most of these like and centered around hauntings. It's like or like there's like it's just like it's definitely feels like it's much more of like ghosts are there. It's modern, and it's like more of like that disassociation when we stopped, like you said, Chris, we started getting more afraid of this kind of thing. It's less common to be around stuff. You're not, you know, and then there's like, you're just, it's like, then now cemeteries are scary, and
Yeah.
it's like,
So now it's time to make it weird and creepy.
sure.
All right, so one explanation is that we just think cemeteries are scary because we've become uncomfortable with death in our modern world. We're very protected from it, and so it's like really alien to us. Or did becoming alienated from death in our modern world increase the number of hauntings because of creating restless dead? I don't know.
You mean like but yes, is that unconsecrated burial stuff, or is that more?
Or is it living shallow lives unincorporated with the spirit world? I don't know, but it's kind of an idea. Like I'll have to watch my terms so we don't get knocked on this. But like so when it comes to like more like there's the notion of alienated labor, and you're doing these jobs, you're part of this assembly process, you don't have pride in your work because you just staple in the tongue on the Nike shoe now or whatever, instead of making a shoe as a cobbler. You do a part and you don't have anything to own from it, and so you feel
It's going into
dejected from
wooden shoe
life.
territory.
Well, no, it should. It should. All of these things should. That's advice I can give. Your shoe size as a wooden shoe is that's your problem, but just enough to do the job. So this alienated labor, and we've got this machine life where we're divorced from the spiritual, and we're just living these things unsatisfied. Does that create the conditions for restless dead? If you didn't have a life that you felt was meaningful because of all the modernization. I'm haunting this again because I'm not satisfied with the graveyards are just creepy because we're not used to them. But so what if graveyards are more haunted now? And I'm going to even go back even further now and talk about graveyard magic, because there's a lot of stuff around taking the dust from a grave and using it in a spell, or so getting into necromancy and the graveyard. Well, there you go. I just opened some cans of worms and then just strolled away from them.
We got a lot of different directions here. So
Yeah.
so let's hang on the cemetery dirt for a second. So I don't know if you know the answer to this, but what types of magic would you use that for? Is it strictly for things related to the dead? Is it like all over the place? What
You
would you
usually
actually use that
so
for?
so there are a couple things. You can use it for to ask the dead for a favor. You're basically asking them for some kind of intervention. And the other idea is also that it's just dirt from graves is basically cursed. Like it's basically like you use it for cursing people, and things like that. Sometimes like death magic, like you're trying to do somebody in with magic, might involve things like graveyard dirt or things of the dead. But yeah, but it's not always something spooky. So for instance, well, I mean, magic people might think it's kind of spooky anyway. I think it's cool. The dust from Saint Martin de Tours. So dust from certain graves of like saints and things like that can be used for good things by asking for, it's like a magic powder now forgetting the intercession of Saint Martin de Tours in your world. Or if you think about, okay, now we're gonna go back into Rome again for a second. Relics, like pieces of saints, is the big Catholic thing, right? So pieces of saints, or their clothes, or things they touched, or you have different orders of relics. Like there's like top tier is basically like a piece of their body, and then it's like a piece of their clothes, and then it's like something that touched their clothes or body, you know, and it goes on. And so you had this thing going on. It was like these basically this competition between European cities on the rise about who could get relics of different things because it would attract people to those cities, to the point that I can't remember which saint it was, but like two European cities, like one of them stole the body from another and took it to another city, and like it's craziness. But it's so you've got the rise of the cult of saints, as it's called, not a pejorative term, but just like this belief structure around saints and the power of saints to do things. Saintly tombs rose up in prominence as special places of power. Maybe that has an influence on how we treated the other tombs, because going back to early Rome, early sainthood was basically any dead Christian was a
Yeah,
saint.
the martyrdom. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was like anyone that had passed on, whether martyred, and actually even those that died of natural causes, which were, you know, it was a mix. What counted as that then? Because your lifespan might be kind of short as a Christian in early Rome. But one of the reasons may have been the violation of the taboo around the dead. Because in Rome, you did kind of keep things sequestered a bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, Richard, you didn't want to disturb people's
Yeah.
ritual burials. Yeah.
And so you had these weird Christian people running around in the early years of the Common Era with a hand from a dead body, or like things like that going on, you know. Yeah, like guess what? Those folks felt very out of sync with like regular Roman society that had a pretty pronounced taboo against that kind of thing. So, to what extent did issues against the Christians have to do with them doing this weird stuff? That's an issue for religious scholars to debate. But it was a thing that was going on, and probably influenced, because a lot of the magic around the saints and things like that influenced later magic in our stuff, you know? And so, to what extent did the treatment of how saint tombs and things were being treated, did that raise up the level of the mystical property or the magical property around tombs and graveyards? So, an unanswered question, although there are people that have speculated on it, but well, at least uh, on the saint end of things, you know. But yeah.
Do either of you know how I'm gonna say disposing of the dead, for lack of better words. How has that progressed over like thousands of years? Like, did they initially burn bodies and then like led to like eventually, and I'm talking about the common person, you know, not necessarily
Right.
like kings or whatever. Was it always burial? Was it? Did you guys know how that progressed over a long period of time?
There's like Neolithic era burial sites. So we've been doing this for a while. I don't know as much as the comment. I imagine it's was probably similar. Like it was just that like why those were more, you know, undisturbed is maybe is probably due to the prominence or like even like that, you know, legends of some restless spirits, things keeping people away. There's like, you know, so it's like, so that's pretty far back, you know, that we've been doing some kind of like ritualistic kind of thing. And then probably it varies from, you know, culture to culture. Like some think like more of like a cremation thing, like you need to burn all of the bones so the spirits will be free. But like, but since it's like, yeah, but I feel like, you know, it's like ancient enough. And I mean, I think even in Egypt, you know, you might not have like a pyramid, but there were definitely tombs, for more common people or just slightly less, like, and the more hierarchical in society you got, obviously, the better your tomb. But that's not even any different than modern, I'll say modern cemeteries, like the last 200 years. I mean, like, the prominent families have giant mausoleums or, like big, monuments, like obelisks, oddly enough, in a lot of cemeteries from certain, like even in the United States, like there's a, and then sometimes if you're a president, you get a really big obelisk. It's but not that George Washington is buried in the Washington Monument, but still, like these kind of, it's a, there's a probably a hierarchical order, but yeah, it's a, I mean, ritualistic burial, like whether it's like stones, mounds, of like that might not be like dug deep or like, but or like that,
Yeah.
like, these kinds of kind of like mound sites that we've built, it's like it is pretty long standing. So it's not a, you know, um, it's like so it must have been like it's a belief that seems to be ingrained in us for for quite some time, So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah, and again, diving into the ancient world and the magic world. I mean, like that, you've got like the story of Antigone, and Antigone has to bury her brother, who's an enemy of the state, basically. Um, and so she buries him once, and then they unbury him, and she does it a second time, which technically was not required.
yeah,
Once you've buried them once, you're kind of okay, but she was kind of making a point. And so, but you've also got a spell from the Greek magical papyri, the headless rite, and it refers to this idea of I am I am the headless spirit, with the headless demon with sight for feet, with sight in the feet. The idea that like you can see under the ground, you can see the spirits under the ground. So it's kind of this idea of, this, yeah, this entrenched kind of, that's where the spirits go when you die, Tartarus, the same kind of idea of like these like underground places of, it just seems like it seems pretty long established in our psyche, our collective psyche, it's,
What about like going to visit the dead? So a lot of times, it's very common for people to go to the cemetery. They bring like flowers on the person's birthday or maybe their parents' anniversary or something like that. You bring flowers, put it by the headstone or whatever. At least in the States, it's very common.
mhm.
How far back does that tradition go? Does anyone know? Because I'm thinking right now, I can't remember who said it in the beginning, but talking about like that it was a public park and people would sometimes picnic there. My first thought was like,
Yeah.
did you go deliver the flowers and have a picnic afterwards, or like, does anyone know how far back that tradition goes of visiting the deceased in the cemetery?
yeah. I don't know. I mean, I imagine it's like even something similar Chris said, like, it's like visiting, like there's obviously rituals around visiting like saints' tombs and things like that, or different, like you were talking about the kind of Christian martyr stuff. I mean, like there, like that tradition goes back to like in Rome, like that goes back pretty long time, going down and having essentially like rituals and things at particular tombs and revisiting them different times of year, or whatever when that
Hmm.
was like, particular thing was necessary. Obviously, like, things like Day of Dead and stuff, like pretty long standing tradition of, going
Hmm.
back and honoring your ancestor, like it's like,
Yeah.
so I imagine like ancestor worship is like fairly common. So I would think that that's
Mhm.
probably like a somewhat of an extension of it. I mean, I feel like we don't do it now as like ritualistically in the same way. It's usually like ritual is like the actual funeral rites, right? And then after
Yeah.
that, it's like up to you to like do that. But I mean, there's also the tradition of people that like go and put flags on soldiers' graves, and they do that, and people will volunteer to do that. So I mean, like there's so I imagine, and then you go back to like probably people visit it like their, if their family's cemetery is basically on their land or in their church, every time you went to church, there's the cemetery something, it's like because the graveyard is literally the yard of the church versus like the cemetery being like a separate thing, like out in the, further, pushed afar from the church. So yeah, I imagine like it's like, it's that kind of like, I imagine it has to be like at least fairly old, or at least rooted maybe in that tradition of like specifically visiting kind of, holiday type, feast day type things.
Yeah, it seems like we've probably had like these like crests and troughs as far as like how we've like done this kind of thing. Because like, well, ancestor worship was probably like fairly common when it comes to like tribal life. As you get more into out of the world of villages and into the world of cities, and you get into the time of like the agricultural revolution and things like that, you start to have this bigger thing going on and this more larger population. And so I wonder, and you've got more quote unquote organized religion. So I wonder how much the focus shifts away from, because what, like, Osiris is the king here and the king on the other side, and so it's kind of like, so there's one dead person to worship, and it's not your uncle or your grandfather or whatever. It's Osiris, it's the king, and so, speaking as a non-Egyptologist who has my own understanding of how it all went, but
or Hades or like any of the death gods, I guess, in that sense. But it's
but to the point that like the worship of the ancestors shifted away into a state religion or something like that. I think you start to then have this like weird hierarchy of spirits, where you don't. So, I guess what I'm saying is kind of like you probably have this point where there's like a very intimate relationship with the spirits of the dead, and then it sort of takes a dip because it's more of a state thing, and then it's kind of like a back and forth thing as we go through time, because like that. Okay, so you've got, I mean, obviously, ancient Egypt was before the Common Era, so it predated Christianity and predated that particular movement of the saints and the cult of the saints, which is another kind of personalization of the dead of our interaction and worship of the dead. If in fact any of it went away, because maybe as a family practice it didn't. So. I mean, like in our house, we have a family practice of like pouring tea for the dead, but most people don't do that anymore. But they might light a candle for the dead at the church. It's kind of a different kind of offering for the dead, or do a mass. They'll have a mass card for the deceased or whatever. Now I'm going into Christian traditions just because that's largely what a lot of at least the American model is based on. So
I thought about this fun concept earlier. So we were talking about different cities that are known for different hauntings, like Edgar Allan Poe in what was it, Paris? Is that what you said?
No, Baltimore.
Baltimore, right?
Where
That makes
Edgar
more
Allan Poe
sense.
is buried. Yes.
Jim Morrison
Jim Morrison's buried in Paris. Yes.
We'll stick with Edgar Allan Poe in Baltimore, for instance. But I had this fun thought, and I gotta believe that this happens at least some of the time because I'm very jaded in this way. Imagine a world where people just start that as a marketing gimmick, as an attempt to increase tourism. And then you have these people come in and it's like, oh yeah, Edgar Allan Poe, he haunts this building or the cemetery or whatever. But then I thought about taking it a step further, and I said to myself, in this time we've been talking, I thought about the concept of the placebo effect, where everyone knows what the placebo effect is.
Yeah.
But the idea where you can then start to make things happen based on your beliefs, as in like the placebo effect. And then
Right.
I started to think about the idea of, and Baba, you you probably both know what this is called. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the idea where you believe something so much that you manifest it, that you make it happen. There's a term for that. I forget what that's called.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a
It's like
self-fulfilling
self-fulfilling prophecy.
prophecy.
Yeah.
It's not it has a different name, but that's okay. But then I thought about this idea. What if like people actually believe it so much because they go in and it's like they're all like hyped up on like Edgar Allan Poe haunting, this part of Baltimore, and then something weird happens, then they tell their story, and it could be completely unrelated, it could just be like coincidence or something. The story spreads, more people believe it, but then like they end up creating a real thing that then actually does a quote unquote haunting. And I wish for the life I could remember that term. I'm gonna have to look it up real quick.
So it was like, I mean, like, so they basically manifested or something into the existence.
They created kind of like an egregore or something. Yeah, I mean, so, and again, like stepping out of the world of the material and into the world of these things can happen, and it's, the idea that like you sort of like feed into this like thought form kind of,
that's it. Thought form.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so you kind of feed into this idea, and then it's often imagined as like you're putting energy into it, and then other people come along and they can sort of tap into that energy that creates more of an effect. So you've got the story of, I don't know, let's go back to, I don't know, Bloody Mary. Okay. So you've got this story of Bloody Mary, and people are like feeding into it. And then is there something metaphysical? Is there a metaphysical energy that you can tap into to produce effects in the world? Like poltergeist effects and things like that. My personal take on it is, I kind of think so. I think there's something about plugging
something
story.
About Bloody Mary.
Something about Bloody Mary.
And a celery stalk.
Yeah, somebody's got to do like a parody, like the hair thing, but like Bloody Mary somehow. Anyway, so yeah, there's something about Bloody Mary. I forgot where I was going with that, because that's just story. Plugging things into story, and if you plug them into it, does it give them more power? I kind of think it does. Like okay, and one of the things going back to saints here we go. All right, so that is Saint Christopher. He's got a dog head.
You can't see Chris is showing his Saint Christopher medal.
I've got a Saint Christopher medal, and Saint Christopher has a dog head. And the reason is because Saint Christopher does have a dog head.
Obviously.
Because at the time, there were some people promoting the idea that there were actually a group of people that did have dog heads. And he was from that group of people. And there's actually a statue, I believe it's at the Vatican, going back to Rome again, of St. Christopher with a straight up dog head, the head of a dog. And so St. Christopher might not have existed. Can you get a miracle from a saint that never existed? And so it turns out that so you've got all these saints that are technically saints. And in order for a saint to be a saint, you've got these miracles that are attributed to them for canonization. And then later on, some of them turn out to not have existed. And so how does that work? Well, if you're a total skeptic, you'd say, well, because it's all BS from the beginning, but you could say, well, there might actually be something about story that lends to an entity's ability to do something. And so you'll actually have this tradition. Now I got to shut this down because I'll just go on forever. You have this tradition of reminding spirits that they did things for you in the past, and therefore they should do it in the future, kind of thing. And it shows up in Catholic prayers like the Memorare. You remind Mary that she did good things in the past and should continue to do that, so...
Anyway, jumping back to Dan was saying about the sort of like the tourist trap element of the cemetery. It's like there's that it's interesting because it's like that is a weird kind of thing of like I guess there's like something like it's like a safe space in a weird sense because nothing usually happens technically in cemeteries, but it's a safe space where something creepy might happen. Like, like so there's that whole like like legend tripping, like the idea of like, well, I mean, just like, like I dare you to walk home through the cemetery, when you're walking home at night, or like something like that, or teenagers
Yeah.
going and doing, things, hanging out in cemeteries, like even though, people don't do it as much, maybe like, in the same way, but it's like that's like it's a creepy spot where it's like people aren't going to be around, and as long as it's not I guess nowadays a lot of cemeteries are privatized land. It's
Yeah,
like it's
yeah.
commercially owned, so you're not allowed to just wander in there. But
Yeah.
but if you happen to live in a city or a town that has has a cemetery like that, like an old cemetery, you can just kind of wander through it. My grade school and high school happened to like be in a town that like had first of all my high school was fairly old and and somewhat like people often associate with hauntings, but we had the church nearby that had an old cemetery, and we would sometimes go there, even like sometimes on like trips out. Like I remember going like for like art class in like middle school, and people did like grave rubbings and stuff, and like, and when we had free time in high school,
Not to be
sometimes.
confused with grave robbings, which is
No, no, no,
not a
no.
grade school
No,
activity.
no, no, no. I mean, that could be a grade school activity as long as it's properly chaperoned. But we would do that, and it was like, kind of things, or like, I remember one time having to, like, we were allowed to, like, in high school, we were allowed to go out, like, just, you could go into town because it was, like, close, you could, a walking, is walkable, and there's like shops and things, and it was during like a finals week, and the fastest way back was to cut through the cemetery, and it's like, but it was like this kind of like also like dare, like, well, do you really want to start running down and cutting through the cemetery and like jumping, it's like there's this whole like kind of like oh well that's like it's like is it creepy or is it like just that I don't know, it has that kind of like not as much like the tourist trap thing, but that like kind of teenage dare going to the creepy cemetery thing. It's like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like there's that or interesting that too that the like just this is another thing you had mentioned about the obviously the Christians hanging out in the things like how like catacombs being used as like centers of resistance. So whether it's like the Christian, martyrs to and the early Christians in like some kind of being persecuted inside of Rome, and or like the French resistance using the Paris catacombs during World War II, hiding out in tunnels.
Hmm.
Yeah. There was a thing I saw that was like even somewhere in like the early aughts, they Parisian police actually found down in the catacombs like people had set up like a movie theater and a bar and all this stuff. It was like an underground, literally underground, like kind of movie theater speakeasy kind of thing where they would guess they were showing like old noir films and stuff. Yeah, it was like had a big projection screen and chairs and a fully stocked bar
In
and
other news, the Parisian police had some reason to wander down into the
catacombs.
catacombs.
Yeah, but it's like, but I mean, I imagine like if you I mean whether you're a common criminal or a phantom of the opera, you're probably you might be spending time down there doing
Yeah.
nefarious things. It's dropping chandeliers on people, then running to the catacombs.
Yeah, and just to do it again, France has a recorded history of diabolism, dark magic. But I'll stay away from it for now. Here we go, folks. Let's talk about commercialism here. If you could have a site haunted by any ghost for personal profit, your choice. Danny C, let's start with you because you're the one that, you win here first. So
Oh man, that's a tough one. That is such a tough one.
Like,
My
is it the
first
site itself, or is it like you pick the ghost?
I think you pick the ghost.
Okay.
Because that would be more.
My first go-to, and I feel like it's very cliche, but my first thought was Houdini. Because I
Ah,
feel like then you can ask Houdini to do anything because he was a magician. Even in death, he can do whatever. Which might work out to be a disadvantage to me if people are asking it to do all kinds of things that I can't make happen.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but then my second thought would be like some kind of notorious gangster. Then I thought Al Capone, and I think he's already allegedly haunts
Alcatraz.
Alcatraz.
Okay.
But I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember if when I went to Alcatraz, I can't remember if that was true or not. So that would be my thing. I think probably someone that has like kind of a shady past, someone like that. I think that would be kind of interesting.
Bill, what do you think?
Yeah. I don't know. It's a good draw. Like, I mean, since we're living in America, I'd probably pick like some kind of if it was about a profitability thing, like, you know, if you actually could make like the Lincoln Memorial actually haunted and like the statue moved and it was actually Abraham Lincoln, because people would like already want to go there anyway, and if it's like, well, on this day we could charge a little extra. On this day, you know.
I need to interject for just 1 second, but because I had this funny idea. I was talking to my father about this. Probably like 6 months ago. Back when I don't think it's really big right now, but for the longest time it was like alien disclosure is going to happen, And I said to
Yeah,
my
yeah.
father, I said, what the government needs to do is say like, yes, we do have a flying saucer and it's in this hangar. You can come see it, but it's going to cost you, and no cameras are allowed, no nothing. And I said they could make a boatload of money. Just people flocking to see this thing, whether it's true or not doesn't matter. Like they could wipe out the deficit like that.
Never stopped disinformation before. The truth has never gotten in the way of disinformation before.
So it's not about like making money off of like hoaxing kinds of things. I just thought I had to share. So I'm sorry, Bill,
No,
continue.
no, that was it. That was my. I really like. Yeah, just I don't know. This is- all right, Chris.
I know I prompted the question. I
Yeah,
don't even know who mine would be.
yeah.
I that's a good question. I'll have to think about that. Blackbeard. Now, some kind of pirate.
Ah,
Well,
Yeah,
Blackbeard
pirate.
probably is haunting, down in like Ocracoke or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a,
He's like, I'd want to be able to
that's hard.
convey
It's
that
a
as a
hard
good
place to get
story.
to.
Yeah, like, are there any famous ghosts in Philly that should be in Philly that aren't Edgar
Yeah.
Allan Poe?
Well, Edgar Allan Poe's in Baltimore, technically.
He was
That's
in
where he's
Philly
buried.
too, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he's
Ah,
buried in
yeah.
Baltimore. That's why it's a
I
yeah. So
I could be wrong. I think the Betsy Ross house is allegedly haunted, but I don't know if it's like by Betsy Ross or someone else, or if I'm making that up completely. I don't remember, but I vaguely
yeah.
remember hearing or seeing something about that.
Well, I mean, also too, like, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of haunteds. I mean, technically, the whole like over on Hog Island, the old Revolutionary War barracks is supposedly like haunted. And but Benjamin Franklin doesn't seem like a person who hangs around it, and he's probably would rather be haunting like Paris or something, which is like where there's more ghosts, to hang out with. He liked it there better, seemingly. So he would probably. It's just,
I picture him in a bar for some reason. I don't know
yeah,
why, just like hanging out like a big
yeah,
tankard of whatever.
yeah, it's like we don't have a good like creepy ghost. Like we don't have a good like phantom type thing. I'm sure. Well, I mean, we have headless horsemen. I mean, I guess that's kind of that's kind of a good American style creep ghost. It's like
Yeah.
but
So,
technically
so
he was a Hessian soldier, I guess, like supposedly. So I guess
hang on that for a second. So Sleepy Hollow, I believe, actually does exist in New York, if I
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah.
So I wonder, and I'm assuming they probably have, if they're smart, they've done this,
Oh,
embraced this story and like made it all kinds of a touristy trap, which is
I'm
brilliant.
sure. I'm sure that. I mean, I would almost be without having looked that up. I'd be 100. I'd put money that's. I'm sure they do. It's like Salem and having like witch festivals and things like that. It's like and having become a center of the thing. So it's like
All right, I changed my answer then. My answer is Headless Horseman, and I just want the spirit itself. I will license it out to Sleepy Hollow, and if they don't like it, I will cause their entire tourism trap to
Yeah.
collapse by actually releasing him into the Sleepy
Even
Hollow.
though it was just a cover up for the murder of Ichabod Crane by Brom Bones, right? That's a
It
So
does.
I'm pretty sure this is accurate. Copyright law, I'm pretty sure that's public domain. I don't remember when it was
Oh
actually
yeah,
created. I want to say a long
yeah,
time ago.
yes. It's Washington Irving. It's
Yeah, oh,
technically
yeah,
the first
yeah.
American horror like official like written horror story, kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely public domain.
And actually, the what's his name uh take on Sleepy Hollow with Christina Ricci and Johnny Depp and
Oh, Tim Burton's yes,
yeah. Now in that one,
Christopher
no,
Walken is the headless horseman.
if you all haven't checked it out yet, cover your ears or eyes or whatever, unless you
Don't
don't
want to
care.
ruin an old,
It's like 20 something years old. I
yeah,
don't know.
like a 25-year-old movie.
Well, they summon the headless horseman. The headless horseman is a summoned
Yeah,
spirit
it
because
actually
what's
is
his name?
witchcraft.
They actually have his head
Yeah.
and use that as a way to control him. Yeah. So that's so actually this idea of having a spirit and making
And not
money
being
off it might
buried,
not be
right?
that original. Yeah.
Yeah, like disturbing a burial site is there you go. To
So how do we wrap this around?
Okay, yeah, let's should we just do a quick ranking on, just let's talk about like just like the idea of the cemetery potentially haunted or not. Let's give it a like quick ranking. I'll go first. So, recognition. Obviously, cemeteries are older than going back to at least ritual burial Neolithic times. We pretty much go. Obviously, the modern cemetery that's not the graveyard is more Victorian era, like that. It's starting more than and like it's like so that's but still it's pretty. Everyone knows what it is. We can think of it in our mind's eye. Cemetery. So good for that. Scary factor. I think just like we yes, it is scary because like we've been culturally conditioned to it being scary. We're of the era where cemeteries are creepy now, like and don't go there, and you know, like even when it's daytime and it's not like because it's like it is. It's like whether it's haunted or not. I guess the idea to us seems creepy because it's just so much in the cultural, I guess, miasma or whatever like that. We think of it as being a creepy place. There's enough of our horror stories and things based around it. It's a trope in and of itself. The cemetery, something's going to happen, right? Yeah. Now, if like let's go say haunting is real or something like that, I'll do a double caveat. Do I want to be in a cemetery, let's say, like a night by myself? No, that would be weird. And also probably not as fun if you were like, if it was to go for a purpose of being there and it's a creepy thing. I don't think I would personally want to do that, even now as an adult, not thinking that cemeteries are haunted. Now, if we take the idea that cemeteries are haunted, like let's just say that is in fact true. Do I want to go to a haunted cemetery? By myself? No. Maybe on a tour for a tourist trap, sure. but yeah, like a ghost tour, like would former gothy kind of kid would want to go on a ghost tour. It's sure. Yeah, but yeah, so so as a creepy factor down the middle, I'm gonna give it a 2.5 monsters for the haunted cemetery. Like I think it's yeah, it's just
Is the
it's
half monster
probably
that you give it the top half or the bottom half?
what was the bottom half for the headless
Oh yeah.
two-headed and one headless horseman.
Use the other half for the monster to summon the rest of it.
Yeah. And then we can up the creepy factor after that. That was like, but so Dan, I'll kick it off to you.
All right. Recognition. I feel like that. Cemeteries go back way, way, way. As we've already discussed, everyone knows what they are. So no surprises there. Scary. I don't think they're overly scary. I've actually. I remember I went to this one like super old cemetery when I was in college, and actually took some pictures, hoping to like see something after the film got, wait for it, developed. But nothing came of it. I would be more scared at night. I would be more scared of like nefarious real people being there. I'd be more afraid of like running into a group of people and like, you know, getting attacked essentially. I'm more scared of that than like stumbling across a ghost in a graveyard. Um, which kind of goes against what I normally say because normally, me, I'm like, well, I'm open to the possibility, but I don't know. I think it's kind of, I think specifically in a graveyard, it's too cliche for me. And then sticking with that kind of, is it real? Sure, it could be real. Ghosts could be, haunting graveyards. It could be haunting anywhere. But I mean, I don't know. It's kind of cliche. Do I want to encounter it again? Don't really want to go into a cemetery because I'm more fearful of bumping into real people doing nefarious acts than actual bumping into something that is of the paranormal nature. So all in all, I am actually going to give this 3 monsters and a leg.
Ah, all right. Three
Yeah.
monsters and a leg.
The leg is of the one that got chopped off from one of the roaming gangs in this. The
Yeah, or it
nefarious,
might be it
like,
might be a relic. I'm not sure. Maybe
yeah.
the three monsters stole a relic. I don't know.
Or
Ah,
yeah, it's like, so it's not a nefarious 1980s gang defacing tombstones in a graveyard.
yeah. After a raucous session of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll hop onto this. Let's see. Recognition. I think we've beat this one. Yeah, we know what they are. So everybody kind of has a sense of it. It's nothing new. Really not new. And so are they scary? It depends. I think they can be. I think. All right, so going back to the thought form idea, there's a vibe of people wandering around mourning the dead, you know? And I feel like some cemeteries have just that vibe, you know? Um, and then some of them actually really ruin that vibe because like a strip mall is right across from the cemetery and like you got a fence, then you got a highway, and then you got a strip mall right there, and it kind of like takes the magic out of it a little bit. Like personally, I think you should plant trees all along the perimeter of your cemetery so you don't look over and see like an old decommissioned Payless shoe store or something like that. But like, yeah, the so I think the old cemeteries or the well kept ones, like the ones that kind of have that little bit of separation, I think they do kind of have like a creepy quality to them. Um, at night, now, would I want to be in one at night? Maybe for like witchy purposes. Not necessarily cursing people, but I do think it would be like a cool thing
Not
at night.
grave robbing again.
No. I'm done. It's a young man's game. But I also would be wary about running into people in the cemetery at night, though. That would probably be my bigger concern because I'd probably be there for the purpose of spirits and things. But mine would more be of the like gun-toting law enforcement type, because they're around cemeteries sometimes at night, you know, and you're not supposed to be. So those consequences are real, and I don't want those either. So, but yeah, I kind of wouldn't mind like if me and Sharon bought and lived in an old church that had its own graveyard. I'd kind of like that actually. I think that would be kind of cool. I'm not like the morbid type either, but like I don't know. I think that'd be kind of cool. And I kind of would go there at night because I wouldn't have to worry about those folks.
I'll interject for a second. One of the first houses we looked at across the street, there was a huge old cemetery.
Yeah. Nah, I kind of dig that, you know. But well, yeah, so do I think these things happen? Do I think they're really haunted cemeteries? I think there are fewer haunted cemeteries than people probably think. But I do think either from a thought form perspective of lots of people bringing their feelings about the dead and things that might create a ripe environment for weird things to happen. Also, something that's removed from regular interaction with society can sometimes, I think, create a space for weird things to happen. Um, and so yeah, I think there's all right. So overall, monsters, I'm going to give it, I'm going to give it, I'm going to give it 3.5 monsters. And it's the upper half
Nice.
because it's still kind of there. It's kind of looking at you, you know.
So this just came to me. Finally, tulpa. That was the word I was looking for.
Tulpa,
A tulpa.
yeah, which
And that is the same thing as a thought form, right?
essentially,
Okay.
it's a. So our understanding of tulpas is the westernized version of an Eastern concept. But yeah, it's kind of the idea of you're creating like an artificial entity with your energy. But yeah, the tulpa, yeah, they got like much more popular in like the last like 10 years or something like that. There's a lot of stuff out there on them, and all these warnings against them. Maybe a tulpa is another
Yeah, I was gonna say,
thing
should
we
we
should
does that
talk
be a thing
about at some
about
point.
spirits created from your mind, and like,
Yeah,
or
oh my
spirits created
God.
from mass hallucination? Is that a thing?
Yeah, well, and that goes back into can saints that never existed do things, or yeah, like those are some ripe topics for some interesting exploration, maybe a little ways down the line. So why don't we hang it? Why don't we put this one to rest?